You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, my name is John Metzelaar, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelves podcast, a series brought to you by The Conference Board. Today, I'll be sitting down with the amazing Ed Morrison to discuss strategic doing, a new way to approach strategy in today's world turned upside down. Ed, it's a delight to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. I discovered you at a webcast of a competitor, and I coaxed you into having a conversation with me. We had several talks already, and I've been absolutely inspired by the way that you think about strategy that is necessary to lead forward in today's world. So thank you for joining me. Terrific.
Thank you for the opportunity, John. I really appreciate to speak with you.
Now I know you've gone back some time. You've been in this business for, as you just called it yourself, decades. You want to talk about those decades of learning about strategy and how you are applying that now in serving customers as well as society.
Yeah. So my interest in strategy stretches back to my first career, which was in Washington on policy focused on globalization and on energy challenges in the 1970s. I left Washington in the early 80s when I was convinced that Washington wasn't keeping up with the challenges of globalization. I went to work for an offshoot of the Boston Consulting Group to work with major corporations that were globalizing, General Electric, Ford, Volvo primarily. But then I left that work and started working directly with communities and regions that are facing really challenging globalization dislocations. And I started using strategic planning as an approach. You can do it, but it's very, very hard. By the early 90s, I decided to go off on a new direction and develop a new discipline for open, loosely connected networks. By 2005, I had a model in my head, and I focused on trying to build that model out. So I went to Purdue University to run test beds and to learn how to teach it. I retired from Purdue in 2019, and I went to the University of North Alabama, where I currently am, and I teach strategic doing in online education really all over the world now. So we're quite excited about that. But it's been a long journey. It's been a long journey.
Well, there's nothing like teaching to really internalize a concept, correct? And so it's great to hear that you, and I think you told me as well that you even got your PhD in economy, right?
That's correct. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in economics.
Which is quite a feat. Terrific. And so strategic doing, is it a bridge too far? I always indeed start my teaching with the definition of strategy, which is a plan of action to achieve a long-term aim or goal. How long is long-term in today's world, and how much can you plan ahead when we're living in VUCA on steroids? But then I read your book, and I was wondering, strategic doing is maybe a step more than what I was thinking. I got intrigued, and I think you are hitting on something very, very significant. So what's the premise of how did you get to strategic doing? What were your insights that actually led you to the concept before we jump into the concept itself?
Well, when you start thinking about really wicked problems, complex problems, where the underlying problem itself is complex, globalization is one of these, and then the collaborations you need to generate solutions is also complex. These two dimensions of complexity lead to wicked problems. And unfortunately, the disciplines that we learned in strategic planning don't lend themselves well to addressing these wicked problems. So you're focused on networks, you're focused in situations where nobody can tell anybody what to do. You don't really know what the solution is likely to be. You have hunches, you have to learn while you're doing. So you're adjusting the same discipline of strategy. Again, your definition of strategy aligns very closely with how I think about it. Where are we going? How will we get there? Answers to these questions give you an effective strategy. But of course, we can't really tell where we're going. We can figure out a desired future where we want to go, but we can't predict that we'll get there. And certainly we don't know how to get there yet because we've never gone on this path. So part of the strategy discipline has to shift from a linear uh, uh, discipline that really focuses on an analysis and moves toward a learning by doing discipline, and that's really what strategic doing is.
And also really internalize that the top-down approach that we have lived in so many decades before, where we were counting on those leaders that would go offsite for several days and come back with the strategy that was then deployed to the organization. That's an old reality in today's world, right? So in that new world of networks, what are some of the skills that you need to develop? What are some of the soft skills, I guess, in particular, that that you need to embrace and exhibit?
Well, the paradox, of course, is the soft skills are the hard skills. In other words, they're difficult. They may be simple, but they're not easy. You have to practice them. But I think paramount to this work is understanding that conversation becomes the key technology or the key method by which we manage strategy and manage the knowledge that's embedded in our organizations and in our networks. So understanding that the job of leadership now is to frame and design and guide these conversations, because it's through the conversation that all the other aspects of innovation, of recombinant innovation, flow. In other words, our ability to identify assets, our ability to combine these assets, our ability to jointly define an outcome that would be valuable to the participants. What is valuable to you? What is valuable to me? What's the mutual benefit in that outcome? And then also the path. How are we going to get there? Try to figure out a pathway forward involves setting up a set of defined Pathfinder projects. So all of these disciplines are embedded in strategic doing. There are 10 skills, and it's all designed around collaboration. Now, what we've learned is that collaborations, effective recombinant innovation, the capacity of people to innovate, emerges out of conversations with a very predictable structure and trajectory. And if you understand that structure and trajectory, you can design and guide these conversations simply by asking questions. And that's really what strategic doing is all about.
Collaboration grounded in conversations is so powerful in my experience, and so undervalued. And frankly, we don't have the skills for this. I mean, even having the conversation. How often do I tell people and students, have the conversation, just have the conversation. And of course, then when we have the conversations, finally, we are poor in actually doing it. We listen so poorly, right? Our default listening is you talk to me and I'll wait for you to be done so I can make my own point. So listening generously with an open mind is already a step forward. And what I call, in the way that you talk about conversation, I call it listening generatively, where indeed I listen to you with an open mind, but then I also start to ask you questions, and you get into this a true dialogue. We forget that the conversation works two ways, or should work two ways. And that's the basis for collaboration, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And part of what strategic doing does is essentially says, look, any collaboration needs a strategy. In other words, any collaboration's got to answer these two key questions of strategy we've already talked about, which is, where are we going? What's the outcome we want to get to? What's the benefit for you? What's the benefit for me? What's that shared outcome that we want to get to? And then the next question, of course, is, how will we get there? How will we get there? And these are all hypotheses or experiments that we have to manage. But we're not going to get there if we don't do something together. We have to start testing our assumptions, testing our hypotheses in the real world. I mean, we can't just sit there. And so that's why doing becomes such a critical part of the strategy process now. Running experiments, what we call Pathfinder projects at the Darden School at the University of Virginia, where I went to business school, they call them learning launches. Whatever way you want to frame it, the idea of going out and testing your ideas, testing your thinking, and moving based on what you're learning, making adjustments based on what you're learning.
So it's wicked problems, addressing those with proper conversation, with real conversations that lead you to collaboration, from which you can experiment, and that creates the learning culture, which has been so elusive for all of us, right? I mean, Peter Senge started to talk about this in 1990. I know Amy Edmondson has written a classic article and more on the subject, probably 10 years later. But still, a long time ago already by now, but so few organizations are actually embracing it. What's holding us back from becoming a learning organization? Are silos playing a role? And maybe I'm leading a bit here.
Yeah, silos do play a role, and silos reflect basically decisions made in the past. So your current silos are like looking in the rearview mirror. That's how your silos emerge. But we don't drive our car by looking in the rearview mirror, so we probably shouldn't drive our organizations by confining ourselves to silos, of course. So the challenge is to bring assets together in new and different ways, to recombine the assets that we have, both inside the organization and outside the organization. And when we do that, new opportunities to adapt, new opportunities to grow emerge from those conversations. Why isn't that happening? Well, because the silos, there's a power structure there. There's a this is the way we do things mentality about silos. And oftentimes you'll see emergent innovation being squashed by the existing power structures. So there's an immune response, if you will. And this was pointed out years ago that this is a challenge. The type of learning that we need, which is adaptive learning, where we question what we're doing and test our hypotheses out. That type of adaptive learning often runs into conflict with routine learning. Hey, are we doing the right thing? Is a question that talks about adaptation. Are we doing it? Are we doing the right protocol? Are we following the right path? That is very difficult for some folks who have a vested interest in maintaining the current system, the current structure. Yeah.
It is no coincidence, in my view, that think different as a purpose has propelled Apple to absolute glory over the last. When was it that Steve Jobs came back? 1997, I think. I remember his coming back speech to Apple, where he lays the foundation of that purpose, and look what it did for them. Indeed, challenge the status quo. Think different, really. So, please.
Well, you contrast that with General Electric. Again, Welch set up a system, very hierarchically driven system with very clear metrics. We're going to be 1, 2, or 3 in the business, or we're going to exit. But following that very rigid protocol of strategy actually led to the demise of a great company. Yeah,
that's a nice contrast. All right, so let's move this on. I think we laid the foundation. You mentioned the strategy is where you want to go, and particularly how you will get there. Right now, then you talk about how. Let's now talk about strategic doing. You mentioned the word questions before. How significant that is in how do you lead forward with experimentation, learning, and eventually scaling. Right. So, what are the 4 questions that you should be asking?
So the 4 questions that any collaboration needs to answer is. What could we do? In other words, listening to find out what are the assets we currently have in our networks, learning from each other. What are the assets we have, and how could we combine those assets in new different ways? What could we do? Then we've got to move from a divergent conversation toward a more convergent conversation by asking the question of all the things we could do, what should we do? What should we do? And here we focus on trying to balance the tension between a big idea and something that can generate a small win. So this is an inherent tension. The third question is, what will we do? This really focuses now on, instead of thinking about an outcome that might be 2, 3, 4 years out, and that's up to you as to what time horizon you use. Let's talk about the next 6 months. What will we do? What's the project? What are the projects that we're going to launch to start moving toward that outcome? And then the what will we do also focuses on a tighter time bucket, which is the 30 days. What are we going to do over the next 30 days? In other words, what's our next step? What's each of our next steps? So let's make sure we understand that. And then what's our 30-30, which is the last question of strategic doing? Really had its origin when we first tried this in the early 90s in Oklahoma City. We we came up with a 30-30 meeting. And the 30-30 meeting had a very simple agenda, but it was a profound agenda. It was basically an hour-long meeting that said every 30 days, that said, what did we learn the last 30 days? What are we going to do the next 30 days? In other words, embedding that double loop learning or embedding that adaptive learning into our conversation.
Terrific. That sounds all great. Simple questions to ask, really.
Right.
But it's not that easy, right? For you to embrace it, adopt it, internalize it, and live it as an organization, you need to apply a set of skills. And I know from the book you have identified 10 skills. You want to talk about some of those and maybe link them to some of your experiences on what have you how have you applied the principles and the skills towards some of the wicked problems?
Right. So the first challenge of leadership is to define the strategic conversation, and there are two skills that are inherent in that. One is to create the space where there is psychological safety. In other words, people are willing to share. So here we have to flatten power differentials. We have to encourage openness. We have to encourage listening. We have to create some rules about how this is all going to work. Behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. We all know how to do that, but we sometimes abandon those ideas. The second skill involves framing the conversation. Asking the imagine question. Imagine we could do this. What would it look like? So instead of creating a vision statement, we're really posing a profound question. We think we can get over here. What would that look like? How would we do that? And so that framing question and the setting the psychological safety rules creates the container for this conversation to happen. Now, once the conversation starts, we have these 4 questions. What could we do? What should we do? What will we do? When are we going to get back together? Or what's our 30-30? Those are the 4 questions. And each one of those questions has 2 skills to it. So I'll dive into that a little bit. What could we do? Well, first we have to learn from each other of what are the assets we have in our networks. Most of the knowledge that we have, who we know, what experiences we have, how we're connected to different resources, what resources could come into play. These are not written down anywhere. This is what they call tacit knowledge. This is knowledge that's hidden. It's not something we talk about. And so when we did this at Purdue University, one of the things that was interesting to me was we talked about a big challenge of reducing the loss of feed grains in sub-Saharan Africa. 30% of the grains that are harvested in sub-Saharan Africa are lost. And so the question is, and of course climate change is going to impact that a lot. So the question is, what could Purdue do to help address that challenge? We have a lot of potential assets. When we got 60 faculty in the room, nobody knew all the assets, but we started putting them up on the wall about what are the assets that we have that we could start to combine in new and different ways. The second step or the second skill is recombinant innovation. Now, this is more lateral thinking, and some people are very uncomfortable with this. It's kind of improvisational thinking. Imagine if we could connect this asset to this asset, what would we see? Or this asset to this asset, what would we see? Or these 3 or 4 assets together, what would we see? What's the opportunity here? And again, this is highly ambiguous. It's very clear that we don't really know, but we're just exploring opportunities. But it's the early steps of recombinant innovation, combining the assets we already have. And so that's a skill.
It's highly ambiguous, you said, but at the same time, you need discipline, right? Innovation is about creativity and discipline. And I like that notion that you introduced in the book, which is you don't call the person in charge of moving forward a facilitator, but you call it a knowledge manager.
Well, we have 2 roles in a strategic conversation, and this is all set out in the book. One is a table guide. We call it a table guide, and the reason we rejected the term facilitator is the facilitator came up in an industrial era. It's really the idea that you're trying to facilitate a conversation between 2 parties that may have conflicting interests or just don't talk to each other. But the role of the facilitator is not to put their thumb on the scale in any way, not to engage in the process too much. We thought this is really not the right metaphor. The metaphor that we wanted to go for was being on a trail or a river guide in a raft, where we're going down this trail or going down this river, and we don't really know how we're going to do this, but what we need is an experienced guide, someone who knows how to design and guide a strategic conversation. So that's the guide role, and is on the journey with you. It's on the journey with you. And the second role is the knowledge keeper. Again, we don't think about taking notes. We think about the fact that while we're talking, we're generating knowledge. We're connecting invisible assets. So this knowledge is extremely valuable. So the role of the knowledge keeper is to start to see these connections. It's not just to take notes. It's to start to understand the patterns that are emerging. And
all right, let's move to the next section.
Sure. The question about what should we do? What should we do? Well, this again involves two skills. The first skill involves identifying, of all the opportunities we have, where should we start? And so we talk about the big easy. And why do we do that? Well, what we've learned is that people will move when they start to see an outcome that they think, oh, that's gonna change the way I work, or that's going to change the nature of the company, or that's going to be valuable. That's a change I want to see. So they want a big idea, but they also need a practical starting point, a small win, a way to move forward. Now, these are obviously intention. So what we do is we use a very simple but profound way to rank these two dimensions using the strategic intuition of the people at the table. There's no way to analyze that. There's no way to optimize. You have to use intuition to use that. Now, intuition doesn't have much of a role to play in strategic planning, but it has a big role in strategic doing. Then the next step is, once you've figured out, okay, this is the big easy. This is the big idea that's going to be relatively easy to do. We need to dig down deeper and say, what is the outcome we want to get to? What is that outcome? So let me give you an example of why driving the conversation deeper matters a lot. Again, at Purdue, we had a conversation around how do we want to get our companies and our students, the companies that support Purdue and our students, to engage with each other more tightly. And until we had an understanding of what is the future that we want to see and describe that clearly, I was thinking, along with several other members of our team, we're talking about moving our students off campus into the company. But another faculty member stood up and said, no, what I see is more company logos in our labs. I see more corporate swag on our students. I see more lunches where company reps and students are interacting. In other words, he was thinking about that collaboration as companies coming to campus, as opposed to students going to the companies. And that ignited a very important conversation about, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about moving our students out, or are we talking about moving companies in? And until we had that conversation about what does the future look like, what are we actually trying to get to? Now, when I was doing joint ventures negotiations in China in the 1990s, the Chinese actually have a word for this. They would criticize my colleague, my business partner and colleague over there, said, look, a lot of American businessmen go from the what could we do to the what will we do, and they forget the what should we do. They forget to listen to their partner about what's the outcome we want to get to. Why is it valuable for you? Why is it valuable for me? Having that conversation.
Invest in having the conversations and learn to listen generously and generatively. So we talked about, you covered the what could we do, the what should we do. Let's move into now the action. What will we do and what's our 30-30? And take only one skill each. I guess if they want to hear the other skill, they should buy your book.
Sure. Well, the one skill, so the one skill on the what will we do is coming up with what we call a Pathfinder project. This could be also, there are other terms for it. At the Darden School at the University of Virginia, they talk about learning launches. But this is a project, an experiment that you're going to define that's going to give you a go or no go decision after a period of time, no more than 3 to 6 months. We time bucket these projects. We make them tight. And so defining a Pathfinder project and then defining guideposts that enable you to manage the risk of the Pathfinder. Guideposts, we don't talk about milestones because people get into project planning. No, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about guideposts. And then making commitments to move forward. Now, the 30-30 is probably the most important part of strategic doing. It actually happens the fastest. You can do it very quickly, but it's often neglected, and which is why this process, when people try to do it without really understanding it, it falls apart, because the 30-30 is critical. And the 30-30 says, hey, our strategy is not complete, never is. It's the process that we care about. It's the learning that we care about. We're going to come back together and we're going to ask ourselves, what did we learn the last 30 days? What are we doing the next 30 days? Is our path the right path? Is our outcome the right outcome? Have we learned new assets that we can move into it? Have we understood obstacles that are changing the landscape for us? This is where you do this very adaptive learning. It doesn't take a long time. It's not a big deal, but it is a discipline. And that's why this 30-30 meeting, which is very tightly run, takes an hour, about an hour. Some 30-30 meetings are, 20 minutes, but, it's never more than an hour. And it's really just saying, are we going on the right path? Are we heading in the right direction? If not, why not? What are we going to do next? And what's our next step? What's our next 30-30? What's our next?
Ed, you have applied these principles to very impressive wicked problems, like how could we build a digital cluster in Charleston? How do we address opioid addiction in our community for Purdue University? How can Puerto Rico recover from Maria, the hurricane? How do we transform engineering education at 50 universities? And even as far as how do we develop a technology roadmap for the destroyer fleet, I guess for the U.S. Navy? Or going into space, how do we collaborate across life sciences within NASA? Within NASA. How? Talk to me about one of these projects, just to illustrate a bit. What have you done? Pick
Sure.
one.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Lockheed project. It's a situation where Lockheed said, "Look, we're kind of interested in this, but we don't really know how this is going to work. But we need to develop a condition-based maintenance map, a technology roadmap of how to deploy condition-based maintenance. The Navy is not really going to pay us anything. So how do we do this?" Well, they also understood that they didn't have all of the assets in-house. They didn't have the expertise, perhaps, in some areas like sensors and machine learning and that kind of thing. So they wanted to get other companies, smaller companies that were further out on the edge of these technologies involved. By running workshops, a series of 4 workshops over 6 months, we developed an initial technology roadmap with the New Jersey Innovation Institute. New Jersey, it's NJIT, it's the New Jersey Institute of Technology. And we started to develop this roadmap. We did the same thing with NASA. Which was the question was, how do we develop collaborations across life sciences? And one of the interesting aspects of this was one of my favorite projects was something called the Uber mouse. It turns out that the life scientists were all, not all of them, but many of them were conducting mouse experiments on mice. But they weren't using the same genetic composition or genetically engineered mouse. And so as a result, the results they were getting from their experiments were not generalizable across. So they talked about developing an Uber mouse, a mouse that everyone could share within NASA. So these are the kinds of things that start to emerge when you say, what could we do? And then identifying, well, what should we do? What's the big idea that's easy to do or relatively easy to do? And so I think this is important, especially in challenges like opioid addiction. We've worked with reducing teenage homicides in Flint. These are really, really complex problems. And what you find is that you're not going to have a single solution to any of these problems. You'll have multiple solutions to them. And part of the opportunity here is to align these multiple solutions and continuously link and leverage these assets across. So leadership now is like paddling a kayak in the ocean. As I said, it's a continuous process of aligning, adjusting, and doing this on a quick basis. It's not a quarterly or an annual budgeting exercise, which is unfortunately what strategic planning has become.
Invest in the fundamentals, and so you indeed steer yourself to where you're going and how. Leverage experimentation, become a learning organization, grounded in collaborations, in networks, and in having the conversations and doing that properly. Asking yourself.
Practicing. I'm sorry. It's practicing these skills, and it's there's skills that are set out in the book. If you just take one or two of the skills and you start practicing the skill in your conversations, you'll start to see how you can design and guide and lead the conversation simply by asking questions and moving the conversation in a different direction.
And then structure them with what could you do and what should you do as the first bucket. And then moving into, and don't skip the what should you do, as you said,
right?
And what will you do and what your 30-30,
right?
To go and get into real action. Ed, I think we have come to the end of this conversation. I think we're running a bit longer even than we thought, but you have so much to share, and it's so relevant in today's world and so valuable. Any last comment on your part before we're going to close the conversation?
Well, these are skills that we all have to learn. Nobody is good at all 10 of these skills. It's kind of like learning how to play the piano or learning how to swim. You can't read a book, although the book helps you. You've got to take the book and start to practice the skills. And so what I encourage people to do is get introduced to these new skills. We've never taught them before. Get introduced to these skills and then just practice them. Practice them in your team, practice them in your family, practice these skills. Understand that designing and guiding conversations is so critical.
And your book is such a beautiful combination of wisdom and practicality, wisdom and actionability. And so I want to thank you not only for being here with us to talk about it, but also for writing it, frankly, because it's quite a work.
Thank you.
And it's very, very valuable. And I would recommend everyone to go out and get it for you, your work, and your career. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure for being with us and spending the 35-40 minutes with us. And I want to also thank the audience for having spent this time with us and invested in it. I hope you found it worth your while. If you enjoyed this episode of Off the Shelf, please remember to subscribe to our Off the Shelf podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. I hope to see you back for our next podcast. We're doing one about every month. And thank you for listening. And thanks again, Ed Morrison. Strategic Doing. Thank you.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.